Hello, everybody. Welcome to our July WEAll talk. My name is 𝒂𝒏, and I'm really excited for this one because it is a book launch. And the book launch is called Wellbeing and Policy Evidence for Action. And we have the authors right with us today who are going to be sharing an incredible presentation. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to our incredible authors. Our first speaker and author is Marie Briguglio. She's an associate professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Malta. She's a lead researcher on several collaborative public sector research projects, including the Malta Wellbeing Index project. We have Natalia, who's a professor of economics and the chair of the Department of Social Sciences at University of Michigan in Dearborn, the United States. And her research interests include behavioral and experimental economics, behavioral public policy, and well-being policy. And then we also have Kate, who is an assistant professor of behavioral science at the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. She researches the reciprocal relationship between human well-being and behavior and works on the application of behavioral science to policy challenges. So we're going to start off with a presentation and then get into some questions and answers at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Marie, who's going to kick us off with the presentation.
So, hello everybody, and I'd just like to start on behalf of Natalia and Kate by saying a big thank you to all the contributing authors and the peer reviewers and Scott's son, who helped us in the early stages of the book. I'd like to thank our respective universities. I'd like to thank the Routledge team, WEAll today, and of course, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I want to start by giving a flavor of the policy background that contextualizes this book. So just a few beats of what we thought matters to convey to you in this launch. There's more details in the first chapter of the book, including all the references to and citations for the stuff that I'm quoting. So one important event happened in 2011 when the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution, which was sponsored by Bhutan, on happiness, which had invited national governments to give more importance to happiness and well-being in determining how to measure and achieve economic development. And then a year later, we saw once again, the UN designating March 20th as the International Day of Happiness and giving visibility to this phenomenon. And at the same time, there was the first World Happiness Report, which of course meant that a new series of data would emerge. Fast forward to 2018, stuff happened in between, but 2018 is important because the WEAll was formed. And at the same time, the OECD held its 6th World Forum on well-being. There were developments at EU level, there were developments prior to 2019, but 2019 was important because it's when the Council of the EU prioritized well-being and called on the Commission and member states to take a well-being economy perspective. There's been work by the WHO. I decided to flag the 2011 10th Global Conference, which culminated in the Geneva Charter for Wellbeing, which the WHO said should result in new priorities for public spending. Of course, in the meantime, all manner of advisory councils, institutes, think tanks, NGOs, and national governments, even regional governments, started to establish well-being frameworks. Notable ones are the Better Life Index of the OECD, the UNECE most recent efforts, although there is still no unified global framework by which to measure well-being. That's just the policy. What's been going on in the field of scholarly literature? Just a few of the books which are closest to ours and which form a kind of ecosystem into which our book, in which our book exists. I won't go into all of these. Some of them focus on measuring well-being. Others focus on how to conduct assessment for well-being impact. Some are multidisciplinary, some are more economics focused. The latest one came out in 2023 while we were collating our chapters. It's authored, not edited, by Layard and Deneve, who are two leading economists in the field, and it summarizes how well-being can be measured, what causes it, and how it can be improved. Once again, these are just some of the books. There's a wealth of literature in scholarly journals, which one way to categorize it would be that literature which examines what creates well-being and the literature on how well-being affects other phenomena. In fact, it's worth noting that there is an actual database on world happiness literature at the Erasmus Happiness Economics Research Organization in Rotterdam, which includes already some 17,000 publications. But despite all of this, we still felt there was a gap in the literature, and that gap was on evidence of what type of policy and what type of interventions actually work to enhance well-being. So a lot of the literature is trying to identify some phenomana's impact on well-being. So, for example, are healthy people in general feeling better in mental health terms? Or does money make you happier? But there's very little literature which explores whether a specific intervention aimed at increasing, let's say, income actually resulted in an enhanced level of well-being for the target audience. Causality is really difficult to identify. It's not easy to say, you know, this policy or this intervention moved the needle on well-being in this audience in this way. And many interventions remain undocumented, limited to the grey literature and different languages, different multidisciplinary approaches. Perhaps WEAll's growing compendium of case studies starts to come close. So with all this background in mind, our dream was to create a go-to resource for anybody looking for key insights from the literature and from policy as to what actually works on well-being. In fact, serendipitously, it was almost exactly 10 years after the first World Happiness Day that we embarked on this book. And we wanted to bring people together who were at the forefront of academia and policy. We wanted short and structured chapters. We wanted chapters not to conduct original research, but to survey and synthesize key findings. And we wanted these findings to draw from both the scholarly literature and policy on the ground. We were keen to have a summary of the evidence, but also actionable points, which in fact we synthesize in cheat sheets that we provide at the end of the book. We targeted policymakers and anyone else who's interested, students, scholars, NGOs, the media, and the key thing was evidence of what works. What we ended up with was a peer-reviewed, open access, comprehensive, we hope, resource for academics and policymakers. I want to also talk a little bit about the methods so that I can help you navigate the book. So there are 16 domains, or actually 16 chapters, which are focused on one specific domain or another. We chose these domains based on what the literature suggests are key determinants of well-being. Kate will talk a little bit more about these specifically. And we also wanted to include a flavor of countries that are actually implementing well-being policy, but we wanted a variety of countries, large countries, small countries, countries from different parts of the world, and at different stages of development in their well-being journey. In total, we had 41 authors authoring these chapters. We also have a foreword and an introductory chapter, and we had 25 peer reviewers. And the chapters, we count, cited a variety of sources totaling over 800, and each of these sources in turn cited other sources. So the book is really bringing together, we hope, a lot of intel in a very small space. We also asked our authors to clarify how well-being was measured in the works that they cite. Finally, just a few words on how we managed the chapters for coherence. Our authors got very specific instructions. The most difficult to adhere to was that they had to stick to 3,500 words, including the references. The chapters all had introduction, a literature review, then evidence of interventions, and a discussion culminating in actionable points, while the country chapters were tasked with giving us a history of well-being policy within the country and a snapshot of the country's performance on global well-being dashboards, then to identify some well-being initiatives, wherever possible, a review of their effectiveness, and some key lessons, once again, culminating in actionable points. So I'm going to stop here now, and I'm going to hand over to Kate, and then later on to Natalia, who will give us a flavor of the content of the book.
Thank you, Marie. So I have the lovely job of speaking about the 16 domain chapters that we included in the book. And as Marie said already, we chose those chapters based on our take on what literature was listed out there and which were the domains in which we had sufficient evidence already to go on that it was worth synthesizing, that we would glean some rich insights from it. And then in terms of getting the chapters into the book, we approached leading experts in the specific domains to write these chapters for us. So, you know, we've got a diverse range of disciplinary focuses and domain focuses that have contributed to the book. Next slide, please, Marie. So the first set of domain chapters covers topics including income, work, health, family, altruism and empathy, aging, gender and education. And obviously I won't have time here to speak to all of the different chapters in this section, but to give you a sense of a few, I'll detail 3. So to begin with, the work chapter emphasizes the importance of work-life balance, flexible working arrangements, social connection at work, and job fit as key factors that contribute to worker well-being, and also emphasizes the sort of interconnectedness of those different factors in either promoting or impeding how people feel while they're at work. It also calls for more collaborations among academics and organizations to better understand what promotes well-being at work. There is somewhat of a dearth of literature on experiential well-being. We know a good bit more about things like burnout and worker satisfaction than we do about people's day-to-day lived experiences while at work. So we could do better there. It's also the case that the chapter points to the fact that there are lots of organizational initiatives ongoing across the world, but that they're very rarely evaluated in a robust way. And so we could do much better in terms of really understanding and unpacking what to do to make people better at work if we took more sort of systematic and robust approaches to their evaluation. The second chapter I'll speak to is the altruism and empathy chapter. This chapter really highlights the fact that it's not just the recipient of good acts that benefits from sort of those good acts, but that volunteering, charitable donation, pro-social behaviors of all sorts of kinds benefit the giver or the doer themselves. And they do so in terms of giving them a warm glow of giving, and being the recipient of gratitude, which is something that feels pretty good, as well as more generally promoting social cohesion. In terms of promoting more of this good altruism and empathy, then they highlight things like emphasizing the connected nature of people and their membership within broader groups to try to encourage pro-social behavior, as well as highlighting social injustice to sort of elicit some more of that empathy, with a view to promoting benefits to the giver and the recipient as well. And finally, from this section, the gender chapter looks at 3 specific factors that relate to well-being as it relates to gender. So it looks at employment, parenthood, and retirement planning, and their implications for well-being. And in doing so, it really makes the case for shifting away from traditional gender norms and the sort of breadwinner ideology to more equitable outcomes across those 3 different stages. So employment, parenthood, and retirement. And then promotes policies like pay equity, parental leave, and the elimination of sex-based harassment and violence as being these key factors that would make a difference from a gender perspective. Next slide, please. The next set, again, not going to be able to speak to them all as before, but we have another set of chapters, this time looking at housing, neighborhoods, environment, crime and well-being, democracy, migration, religion and spirituality, digital technology, and art and culture. So the housing and neighborhoods chapter suggests that housing tenure as well as housing quality is really important for well-being, and that the financial burden that sometimes comes with housing costs can be detrimental to well-being. Generally, looking at the housing intervention literature, it finds that it can promote well-being, but it seems to matter how those interventions are kind of put in place. So stakeholder involvement is a key factor that influences the impacts of housing initiatives on well-being. And then there's a real push from that chapter to include well-being assessment within the evaluation of housing initiatives. The chapter on migration indicates that migration actually has a fairly minimal impact on the host country or the population's well-being in the host country, but that it really benefits the migrants themselves, and that migrant well-being is particularly sort of promoted or maximized when they are able to successfully integrate into the host country while also preserving their cultural identity. So here the chapter really pushes for the idea that we need to have policies that support cultural adaptation, as well as ones that preserve people's heritages and where they come from. It should shift towards evidence-based integration policies that, address things like social connection, anti-discrimination, and cultural participation of different groups. The very last one that I'll speak to is the art and culture chapter, who I actually saw Leonie is on the call, so she wrote this chapter for us. I hope I do it justice. So Leonie's chapter is really, really lovely. It highlights the well-being benefits of engaging in art and culture, both passively and actively, in terms of things like enjoyment, social connectedness, distraction from suffering, self-esteem, self-expression, skills development, self-efficacy, and states of flow. So lots and lots of good stuff emerging from there. She's also, her synthesis of the literature also suggests that both active and passive forms of engagement are beneficial, but that the active type is particularly so. It's also the case that her chapter highlights the fact that disadvantaged groups benefit particularly from this kind of engagement, but they're also less likely to be able to access it. So the kinds of policies that her chapter are calling for are things like support for artists through increased funding and employment opportunities, promoting engagement amongst the general public of active engagement in arts and culture, and then subsidizing arts and culture for people from a disadvantaged background. Next slide, Mary, please. So there was lots of rich insights. I haven't done those chapters justice, not to mind the ones I haven't mentioned, but the book is, as we'll say a few times, I think on this call, open access, so you'll be able to read them all. But we, as the editors, had the sort of nice position to be able to look across the chapters, the domain chapters, and think about what it was telling us more generally about the well-being literature, get a bit of a bird's eye view. And kind of by design, because of the way that we chose the chapters, it was true that where we looked, correlational evidence was pretty abundant and growing. This was particularly true when we were looking at measures like life satisfaction. So we understand quite a lot about how domains relate to evaluations of well-being, less so in experiential well-being. But across all of the domains, it was the case that more causal evidence was needed. It is much, much rarer in this field, although it's emerging and welcome as it is. It's also true that across the different chapters, and we were open about this, about how the authors defined well-being for themselves, although we did insist that they provided a definition for their chapter. But across the literatures, more generally, different definitions are being used. And where we saw examples of multidimensional approaches, so for example, people using both evaluative and experiential approaches to try to unpack relationships with well-being, we were gaining richer insights than we could by just taking one single approach. And then another sort of call to action, the evaluation of the impact of interventions, which was one of the main motivators of this book, was still too scarce. We really need more sort of well-being evaluations of policies and of interventions to better understand how to change in ways that will benefit people, as well as more the longitudinal studies and heterogeneity analysis. So we need to understand how do these domains relate to people's well-being over time and also differently for different groups. Lots more work to do, but still lots of interesting and important insights already there. Okay, I'll pass to Natalia now, who's going to take you into the country chapters.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Marie. So I'm very happy to be here. And so as I said, I will be talking about the country chapter. So when choosing countries for country chapter, as Marie already mentioned, we wanted to have various levels of advancement towards well-being agenda. So we included both front runners and those countries which are just starting to introduce well-being considerations into their policies. So the third part of the book includes 9 countries: Bhutan, New Zealand, Finland, United Arab Emirates, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, Japan, and Malta. And so on the cover of this book, you can see there are 25 icons corresponding to 25 thematic chapters. So 9 of them are actually maps of those countries. So as a fun activity right now, you can try to identify those countries and to see how many you can recognize by their shape. But yeah, back to more serious, back to chapters. So I wish I can talk about all of those chapters in more details, but that would probably require the entire day. So instead, I will just briefly discuss the commonalities and differences of those chapters and summarize the major takeaways. When it comes to commonalities, the authors of all countries agree on advocating to, unsurprisingly, move beyond GDP towards incorporating broader measures of well-being into their policy goals. Also, all authors agree on the need to address inequality and disparities. While economic factors are considered, the authors highlight the importance of non-economic factors such as work, health, environment, governance, and cultural aspects. Also, the authors recognize that successful implementation involves collaboration between different governmental departments, academic and research institutions, and civil society. And finally, all authors agree that all authors talk about the challenges in fully implementing policymaking, such as inertia, the cost of data collection, especially for smaller countries, ensuring political frameworks, adapting top-down initiative for local use, and overcoming institutional barriers, among others. While there are a lot of commonalities for those chapters, there are also quite a few differences in well-being policy implementation. So in this set of countries, first of all, by selection, obviously the countries are at vastly different stages. So Bhutan, for instance, has a decades-long history with its gross national happiness philosophy integrated in its governance framework. Finland has an established economy of well-being approach and action plan. UAE has created a national well-being strategy with specific ministries and programs. So second difference is that while all frameworks are multidimensional in every country, the specific country's priorities, context, and values are driving implementation. For instance, New Zealand uses the Living Standards framework and the Hiara Waiora, incorporating Maori perspective. Apologies for mispronouncing it. The UK has national well-being program and specific priorities areas like work, mental health, relationship. The UAE takes a holistic, integrated approach across sectors. Then also each country faces specific obstacles related to its geography, demographics, political structure, history, and societal issues. For instance, Australia highlights geographic and climate challenges. Bhutan is addressing mental health and inner poverty alongside economic goals. Canada talks about challenges of incorporating indigenous populations' perspective into well-being policy. Japan discusses challenges related to aging population. The country also differ by the extent to which well-being is integrated into their major governmental processes, such as budgeting and policy appraisal. New Zealand, for instance, has a dedicated well-being budget and tool for cost-benefit analysis. The UK Treasury has guidance for valuing well-being impacts. Finland is developing impact assessment. And finally, while many determinants are common throughout those countries, certain countries place particular emphasis on specific areas based on their context. For example, Japan highlights work style reform and social security for the elderly. Australia and New Zealand both address indigenous well-being disparities. Finland and Malta emphasize sustainability issues. So those differences are obviously getting translated onto the actionable points that the author suggested. And while many of those actionable points that are both at the end of the chapters and in the appendix that you can easily look up, we can still observe the unifying scheme for advocating for shift towards well-being focused and sustainability focused institutions and policies and away from hyper-competitive approach. So in particular, 5 points kind of stand out and they are highlighted here across those 9 chapters. So these actionable points are calling on policymakers to prioritize evidence-based policies by investing in research and collaborating with academics to develop and measure the impact of interventions. This book also calls for regular collection and analysis of both objective and subjective well-being measures. It calls for engagement, for broad engagement with communities in the policy design by using bottom-up processes to define and support well-being frameworks, and such processes must involve in a fair representation of all minority groups, and if relevant for the country, this should leverage indigenous perspective on spiritual and inner growth to diversify understanding of well-being issues. It also calls for performing well-being impact of all new policy proposals, regardless whether or not they explicitly stating well-being as one of their goals. And finally, the book calls for transparency, so for regularly reporting well-being metrics and for being transparent in communication of both well-being achievements and, perhaps even more important, well-being failures. So in closing, I want to say a huge thank you for all the authors. It was a privilege to be part of this group and to collaborate with researchers from across the world. We are sincerely grateful for them, and we hope that in bringing them together, we added value to their remarkable work. So please read the book. And on the next slide, we have a QR code that which you can use with your phone to access the open access. There is also a link in the chat for the book page, and then there is in the middle there is a link to access the open version of the book. So please, we invite you to read it, share it with others in your network. And of course, in closing, I would like to thank you for making the time to come today to listen to this talk. I'm looking forward to the questions in the chat and otherwise. And we would like to thank WEAll for inviting us here and letting us speak about the book. So thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Fantastic presentation, and I'm sure there's something for everyone in that list of domains and countries to dive into the book. So we've got some great questions in the chat already. So let's start with some of those, and then we'll get people to put their hands up because we have plenty of time for conversation. And a big question, first of all, from Vlad, and he asks, is a well-being economy compatible with capitalism? And I'd love to hear the author's views, the editor's views on that. For us, obviously, at WEAll, it was in my mind listening to you that I'd love to hear more as well about how the economic system shows up in this research and in the synthesis that you've done. When Natalia was presenting the common findings and implementation struggles, we would see the economic system as the ultimate constraint. And we see that in our work with policymakers as well, that progress on well-being and a well-being economy kind of happens in spite of the economic system, because we've not got a system designed with well-being at its heart. So I'd love to hear reflections that you have, or points that we could go to in the book that maybe there's particular focus on the economy and economic system change as well. So
I'll have a stab at answering that, or start to answer that. Essentially, the book is about intervention. So it's really about not allowing the free market to do what the free market does without some kind of government intervention. But it's a further step to that, because it's also asking, does intervention work? So it starts from the perspective that, of course, we need intervention for well-being, but it goes further to then ask even not just whether the market fails, but also whether government fails, and how to avoid the sort of wicked problem of having both market failure through purely capitalist approaches, which do not address equality issues and which do not address externalities, but also recognizing that not all interventions work.
thank you, Marie. Kate?
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in. So maybe in my summary, it was hard to know which of the chapters to summarize, but the first chapter in the book is on income and well-being. It's by the wonderful Laura Cudgerna at the University of Birmingham. And many of you maybe are aware already of the literature on income and well-being, but it really emphasizes the benefits of redistribution in particular, because there are diminishing marginal returns to income at the top of the income scale. We can really do an awful lot of good by redistributing. And so that isn't, to me, the sort of hard face of capitalism. But that chapter is really brilliant and goes into the nuances and detail in that literature of the sort of shape of that curve and how that relates to income and different forms of well-being. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is one of the challenges that's sometimes leveled at subjective well-being research is that it sits within a neoliberal ideology, in the sense that it focuses on the individual more than the system. And I deal with this sometimes in my MSc class that I teach as well, of thinking about whether measuring at the individual level precludes us thinking clearly about the sort of social system and the economic system within which individuals operate. But if you look at the implications, as Marie has said, of all of the well-being literature about how we would construct societies and economies and tame capitalism with a view to benefiting well-being, I don't think that challenge has that much merit, because even measuring at the individual level helps us to understand much more about what would benefit, or how we could shape societies in a way that benefits. So incompatible, I don't know, but certainly would point to a different form of capitalism than the one that we currently operate in.
Thank you. We've got lots of wonderful questions in the chat, so let's keep moving. If anyone is happy to ask their question verbally, we'd love to hear your voices as well as mine. So you can click on react with the love heart at the bottom, and then raise hand if you'd like to ask a question that you've already put in the chat by speaking it into the group, or a new question. But I'll keep moving down. And Meta has asked about, did any of the countries in the country section of the book address the effect of digitalisation and AI on well-being? Did that come up in the country section? I know there's a digital chapter as well, so is there anything you'd like to share on that topic?
So certainly there's a digital chapter in the domains. So maybe I'll speak briefly to that and ask Natalia about the countries. I don't remember specifically from the countries that coming up. AI was maybe less on the radar when we started this book than it is currently. But within the digital chapter, there's definitely a focus on individual differences. So Diane Pelly wrote the chapter for us, and she does an amazingly detailed review of the literature out there on digital technology and well-being. And her takeaway is that both the literature needs sort of to be more robust, but also that there's a huge amount of individual difference in the intensity and the ways in which people use digital technology that will have important implications for well-being. So it's not all bad or all good. It's much more about how and for how intensively are people using it. And then she also has quite a hopeful end to the chapter where she's talking about the potential positive ways in which governments can leverage digital technology to enhance people's well-being. Better systems, more sort of targeted and tailored systems that promote well-being. So that's the digital chapter, which is available. But Natalia, maybe you could speak to the countries. As far as I'm aware, I don't think people addressed it as a key topic.
Yeah, I don't think that people addressed it as a topic, but I think that this is not because people are not interested, but when when the chapters were due to the publisher, so by then it was just only starting, the AI started to get into the front of things. And I guess the literature, because people were asked to comment on the literature and synthesize their literature to see the interventions. And back then we didn't have all that much, but definitely the environmental concerns and other concerns, yeah, would have surfaced if the timing was a bit different. So, but thank you for the question. Yeah, that's definitely an important one. And all of us are, like, in all dimensions, are struggling with that and trying to understand the future.
Thank you both. And Mark, thank you for putting up your hand. Please bring your own question to the speakers.
I did post it in the chat, but my ego is happy to have myself voice the question out loud as well. No, I would just love to know from the authors, even though it's early days in terms of interventions that can actually maybe cost effectively or scalably affect well-being, what do you feel are your best guesses right now, or avenues that you feel are really promising to be explored?
I love this question. Thank you, Mark. And I think we could go on forever, but I'll start with, I mean, for me, addressing the well-being of the ill, of people who are suffering ill health and ill mental health, is even morally the go-to point. That's where I always start. But sort of more joyously in terms of a low-lying fruit, which is so underexplored and is a gift that can keep on giving, is this exploration of altruism, of encouraging people to be kind, to do good things for others. And it's almost resourceless, because you're basically asking people to mobilize their own time and money to get something back, and at the same time be giving and be generating well-being in those to whom they give. It's such a lovely area to explore, and one that I could honestly speak about for a long time, and it puts a real smile on my face to think about that.
Maybe I'll jump in with my pet one. So I think we have really, really good evidence on the benefits of nature exposure, the importance of environmental conditions. So it's not always easy to improve environmental conditions in drastic ways, but there is solid evidence that, some nature exposure can be protective of people with poor mental health, but also helpful for people, all of us, in stressful moments in our life. It acts as a buffer to stressful life events. It restores our cognitive bandwidth. So there's many, many benefits of nature engagement of different kinds. And so that's something that actually is, going against, at least in the UK, the trend is going in completely the opposite direction. People are spending less time outdoors, less time in nature. And it's one of the really solid findings from the literature that I would, bet my hat on. We should be trying to encourage and do more of.
And I think,
Natalia.
yeah, so if I can jump in here. So I think that I would highlight the well-being at work and the importance of the importance of social connection, the social dimension, and support system structures that we can put in the workplace. Because if you think about it, we are spending like a third of the time, or maybe like a half of the time of our hours at work, and the importance of it, and what type of structures we can have in our organizations, and what type of approaches, supporting approaches, just support each other between employees, but also support from the management, and developing well-being policies that will be supportive both of mental and physical health, and also flourishing of individuals throughout their workplace and throughout their careers.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. And Leonie, I see your hand is up, and I know that you are the author of the Arts and Culture chapter. So do you want to weigh in on this as well? And congratulations on the launch to you too.
Thank you. Yes, if I may. Well, my 2 cents worth is obviously that arts-based interventions can have a very positive effect on well-being. Kate, thank you for your succinct summary earlier on. You did a great job. And as Kate pointed out, active engagement seems to be more effective than passive engagement, meaning that, if you actually take part in creating art, now art broadly defined, art and creativity broadly defined, it doesn't have to be the big C creativity that everybody thinks about of, art that goes into museums or performances on stage. But even the little C creativity that we can all engage in every day, that can have very positive effects on well-being, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. So I know that also on the chat there have been some concerns about expenses involved. So my take is that we encourage individuals to do as much as they can in the area of creativity, art, and culture.
Thank you, Leonie. Totally agree. I'm going to move on in the questions. Judy has asked about the selection of the countries for the country chapters, noting that I guess the developed world, the terminology we tend to use is the majority world rather than global south or developing, and that none of the countries selected are from the majority world. And can you say something about that selection process? Thank you, Judy, for the question.
I can start with that. So let me start from some of the constraints we had and some of the wishes that we had. But we wanted diversity. We wanted the countries to at least have started doing something. And we wanted to find authors for those chapters. So we were also constrained by not having the possibility to survey many countries, because a book of this nature, something about the editorial process, has a word limit of 100,000 words. And with this many chapters, you're looking at very few countries that could come in. Then we needed the countries to offer diversity, to be already on the path, and to be available to write within the time constraints. So I think we've got some countries which we couldn't afford not to have because of their contribution already to the well-being policy spectrum, like Canada and New Zealand, Finland, because they always score so well on well-being metrics. And then we've got countries that really were movers and shakers, like Bhutan. And then we've got countries that are less, but nonetheless starting on the path, such as Malta and perhaps Japan, which has less of a sort of articulated policy compared to, say, Canada or New Zealand. And of course, there's many other countries that could have been in the book and should be in a book, and maybe that would be the book that follows this one, because I think a geography of well-being and of well-being policy is highly merited and needed.
Thank you. We've got lots more questions, and I almost missed Timo's question, which came before Mark's in the chat. So I'll go back to that. Timo had asked if you could comment on where things are and what came out in the book regarding employee well-being and mental health and healthy workplaces. He said it's impression that it's still an issue. Kate, that was one of the domains that you'd mentioned. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think I briefly mentioned this already, but there is quite a lot of worker well-being initiatives happening in sort of slightly larger organizations. And there have been, and the Oxford Wellbeing Research Centre has done recently quite a bit of work trying to get a handle on their efficacy. So things like mindfulness-based interventions, you know, different kinds of trainings to help you cope. And the sort of main message from that literature is that there isn't actually a lot of positive impact, sustained positive impact coming from some of those. And one of the sort of reflections on that literature is that these are sort of bandages to sort of more structural issues that are facing worker well-being at work. Like we have a discussion of burnout in the chapter as well. There are challenges around work that won't be solved by telling people or helping people to be more mindful. And that really some of the more structural things like pay and work hours and work-life balance, as well as the fit between your skills and your actual job that you're doing, are more fundamental factors that are going to make a difference for well-being. So our reflection on the literature is that some of these we don't use the word bandages, but that's what I'll use in this company, are actually maybe distracting from some of the more structural things that need addressing. And that's our call for sort of more collaboration and trying to find initiatives that actually really do move the dial on worker well-being, because as we know, it's something that's a huge challenge. The sort of statistics around burnout are really very scary, and mental health challenges relating to work are really very damning. And yeah, I think the initiatives so far haven't been properly evaluated, and to the extent that they have been, it doesn't seem like they're really making the kind of difference that we would want them to.
And I'm conscious we probably won't get to every single question, but I see two other questions related to unions and solidarity economies, like worker cooperatives. And I wonder, just while we're in this headspace of thinking about work, Kate, if either of those dimensions of workplaces featured in the research as well.
Do you know what? It didn't, but it's a brilliant question. I think we might keep that one again for the next edition, Marie. But no, it didn't come through. There is, not to make it the same thing, but there is some brilliant work in the democracy chapter on the importance of involvement and voice and procedural utility, like feeling like you're listened to and really having some power. So I'm sure that there's an overlap of those literatures where we could say something. We didn't in the current chapter, but I think it's a great suggestion, and it's something that you're going to take away.
Thank you. Okay, and again, feel free to raise your hands if you want to ask your own question and stop listening to me, but unless you do, I'll keep going. So Samantha Richardson is looking for any insights on what inspired governments, or what it took for governments to prioritise well-being. That's a really interesting question. Do you have any insights on that?
I mean, one of the things that is emphasized in the Malta chapter is that there is a high thirst from the public for this. So things related to well-being are well met. The media reports them, and it's as though when governments announce something, they are leaning on open doors towards well-being. Of course, what we have to be careful with is that we don't venture into the territory of well-being washing, which we're, well familiarized with in the domain of greenwashing and sustainability washing. So, we have to be careful that governments are inspired to actually do policy for well-being and not just say they do policy for well-being.
And if I can join, Joanne Smithson was on the chat. She wrote our wonderful UK chapter, and she has this amazing timeline in her chapter that I'm going to save and use and shove in people's faces very, very, very regularly, about how the well-being policy landscape evolved in the UK. And it kind of came from, there was sort of a leadership announcement, a David Cameron sort of announcement, but I'm not saying it was well-being washing per se, but whether it had that much thought behind it, I don't know. But it led to sort of metrics being collected. Then there was data that was being, being released on a sort of quarterly basis. So people's well-being was being tracked and reported back to the public. And then a whole ecosystem then developed around that in terms of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing that Joanne worked at, where there was really a focus on, if this is something that is, you know, something we're monitoring and say we care about, how are we going to make a difference in that sphere? So it's a beautiful chapter in the sense that it really tracks how that flourished and developed and the sort of inspiration from the very beginning. So really recommend it.
Also, just to again, in the case of Malta, for example, we had the Malta Foundation for the Wellbeing of Society, which was really promoting constantly this notion that we have to consider well-being inequalities in Malta. So I think with having this sort of entity whose job it was to focus on well-being, combined with the media reception and the time, you know, it was sort of the time around the world. I think that WEAll also feels this. When the world wants to listen to this question, wants to discuss, wants to debate this question. Personally, having worked in sustainability for many years and now working in well-being, I certainly feel that there is a greater willingness to listen to how to move towards well-being than there was about how to move towards sustainability. Somehow the notion of well-being resonates more. It's more immediate. It feels better to talk about it than to talk about restraint and to talk about future generations, even if there is a huge overlap between what countries must do for sustainability and what they must do for well-being. Yet somehow it seems to resonate more.
Thank you.
And I also,
please, Natalia,
yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So I also wanted to add that when it comes to like a country orientation and bringing well-being to the forefront, it's also like important to think about it that it's possible to have a like top-down type of approach, right? Something that Kate mentioned, yes, with the example of the UK, but it can be also more like bottom-up approach, yes, through the engagement of communities, through the developing those processes that define and support well-being framework. Because in several chapters, in country chapters, we notice that there are even discussions within the countries about what well-being means, maybe for different groups. Yes, so what well-being means for one group of population, one population or minority population, and also in terms of the bringing indigenous perspective. So like in Canada chapter, in Australia chapter, and New Zealand chapter, they are bringing to the forefront. So how can we bring everybody to the same like a table in terms of the definition and what would be our goals, and should our goals be very unified, or should the goals be left to those who will be affected by those well-being policies that we are working in terms of the bigger framework, but each strata kind of deciding what is important for them.
Thank you.
And also different focuses. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, we're not going to get to all of your amazing questions. I'm just going to pick one last question and ask each of the three speakers to give us a short response to this one, if you can, before we wrap up. And Fatima Zara has asked, I'm picking one that's the most specific to the book of the remaining questions, so forgive me taking liberties and not getting to all of them. She's asked, given the broad and varied definitions of well-being, did countries find this diversity helpful or limiting? And was a global definition seen as necessary, or is it good to have these context approaches to the definition of well-being? So if you'd like to, any of you come in and answer that one, and keep it brief if you can, and then we'll have a couple of minutes to wrap up. Thank you.
I think for me, the exercise of the book is to let other countries and other researchers in other fields know what others are doing. I think there's all this wonderful work happening around the world and in different disciplines that relates to well-being, and almost shedding light on the different ways we're thinking about well-being or focusing on different parts of subjective well-being as well as objective well-being. It's kind of the first step, whether we all come together and cohere to a final definition that we can agree on, I wonder, but at least understanding what other people are doing and how they're approaching the problem and seeing the value in other approaches or seeing the context, the different ways that context matters, I think is, yeah, it's a good start.
It also,
and I also think,
where
yeah, go ahead, Maria.
at the moment, which is that there is no consolidated definition. There is no system of national accounts which yet synthesizes how to define and measure well-being. We're getting there. There are notable efforts like the Better Life Index of the OECD, and we've got now regular data coming from the World Happiness Report, and the UNECE are trying to coordinate a definition. But at the stage when this book was written, it's a stocktake of diverse ways as well of how countries are measuring their well-being. In fact, we asked the country authors, please give us an overview of how well-being is measured and how the country is doing on those metrics. So, you know, every book in its context, and this book in its context too.
Yeah. And I just wanted to highlight the importance of priorities that countries are putting into different aspects of their development, maybe being environmental challenges or challenges with aging or with income or disparities. So it's kind of like important. Every country can pick up something that would fit them, would fit their priorities, and we are providing the menu rather than just saying, oh, this is like the way to do it and this is not the way to do it. No, like it's
Thank you. Thank you all, and I'm sorry to cut you off, Natalia. We're at time, so I will just wrap up by thanking all three of you, Marie, Kate, and Natalia, for that fantastic presentation, and to all your authors for this book. I've only read the first chapter, so I'm excited to finish it. And to all of you, thank you for coming. If you're not already a member of WEAll, it's free, and please be part of this community and conversations like this. You can also engage on our digital platform. So many amazing questions and conversations have been started in the chat today, and I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, but I would encourage you to take them to the WEAll Together platform, and maybe we can continue the conversations there, and maybe we can also keep chatting about the book once everyone has read it. Have a bit of a book club on there as well. So 𝒂𝒏 and Amira are putting lots of links in the chat for WEAll's newsletter, joining as a member, getting active on the digital platform. It's all open and free, just like this incredible book. So thank you all for being here. The recording and the chat notes will also be shared by 𝒂𝒏 soon as well. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, and thank you, Matilde, for your translation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.